Marcus Johnson was a man who traveled a lot. He worked hard and had to fly to different cities for his job. Today was just another work trip. Or at least, that's what he thought. It was a busy afternoon at the airport. People rushed around, pulling their suitcases behind them. Some people talked on their phones, others stood in long lines waiting to board their planes. Marcus was used to this. He had done it many times before. He held his ticket in one hand and his small carry-on bag in the other. He had checked his seat number before boarding, 24A, a nice window seat. He liked sitting by the window. It gave him a chance to look outside, watch the clouds, and think about life. As he walked toward the plane, he took a deep breath. The smell of coffee, perfume, and airplane air filled his nose. He was tired, but he was looking forward to sitting down, relaxing, and maybe even taking a nap. Marcus stepped onto the plane and walked down the aisle. The flight attendants stood at the front, greeting passengers with big smiles. "Welcome aboard," one of them said. Marcus gave a small nod and kept walking. The plane was filling up fast. Some people were already seated, reading books, watching movies on their phones, or chatting with family and friends. Others were still finding their seats, stuffing their bags into the overhead bins. Babies cried, kids wiggled in their seats, and flight attendants helped people get settled. Marcus glanced at his ticket again. 24A. He walked down the narrow aisle, carefully moving past people who were standing or putting their bags away. He counted the row numbers as he walked. 20. 21. 22. 23. Finally, he reached row 24. But something was wrong. There was a woman sitting in his seat. Marcus stopped and looked at his ticket one more time, just to make sure he had the right seat. "Yes, 24A. He smiled politely at the woman. She was dressed in a fancy red sweater and had big sunglasses resting on top of her head. She was scrolling on her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. Maybe she had made a mistake. Marcus cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said in a friendly voice. "I think this is my seat." The woman barely looked up. She sighed and said, "No, I don't think so." Marcus blinked. Maybe she had misheard him. He pointed to his ticket. "I have 24A. See? It's a window seat." The woman sighed again, this time louder. "Well, I'm already sitting here," she said, her voice sharp and annoyed. "Can't you just take another seat?" Marcus felt a small knot in his stomach. He had been flying for years, and never had someone refuse to move from his seat. The people sitting nearby began to watch. A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows. A woman in the next row glanced over her shoulder. Another passenger, a young girl sitting with her mom, whispered, "Why won't she move?" Marcus stayed calm. He wasn't here to fight. He just wanted to sit in the seat he had paid for. He tried again. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat. Maybe we can check with the flight attendant." The woman rolled her eyes. "Ugh, this is ridiculous," she muttered. But she didn't move. Instead, a flight attendant walking down the aisle stopped next to them. She was a young woman with blonde hair tied in a neat bun. She had a friendly smile, but when she spoke, her voice was firm. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, looking between Marcus and the woman. Before Marcus could speak, the woman in his seat jumped in. "This man is bothering me," she said quickly. "He's trying to take my seat." Marcus felt his chest tighten. That wasn't true at all. He wasn't trying to take her seat, she was in his seat. The flight attendant turned to Marcus. "Sir, I need you to find another seat. We're trying to get everyone settled as quickly as possible." Marcus frowned. "But this is my seat. I have my ticket right here." The flight attendant barely glanced at it. Instead, She sighed and crossed her arms. "Sir, please don't make this difficult. There are plenty of other seats." Marcus could feel the eyes of other passengers on him. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. He could hear whispers. Why won't they let him sit down? Doesn't he have a ticket? This isn't fair. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. He had always been taught to stay calm in situations like this. He knew that if he raised his voice or acted angry, things could get worse. So he took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice steady. "I understand you're busy," he said, looking at the flight attendant, "but I paid for this seat. Why should I have to move?" The flight attendant sighed again. "Sir, I'm asking you nicely. Please take another seat." Her voice was sharper now, less friendly. Marcus could feel the shift in her tone. It wasn't just about finding a seat anymore. It was about power. And he had a bad feeling about it. A man sitting a few rows back pulled out his phone and started recording. Another person, a woman with curly hair, turned to her seatmate and whispered, "Did you see that? That's not right." Marcus saw it too. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about something more. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over yet. Marcus stood there, gripping his ticket tightly. He could feel his heart beating faster. This wasn't just a mistake. The woman in his seat wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she was doing. And the flight attendant? She didn't even want to listen. More passengers were paying attention now. Some leaned in to hear what was happening. Others pretended not to notice, staring at their phones or looking away. But Marcus knew they were watching. He took a deep breath. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to raise his voice. But he also wasn't going to give up his seat just because someone thought he didn't belong there. "Ma'am," he said as calmly as he could, "I understand you're trying to get everyone seated quickly. But this is my assigned seat. I have my ticket right here." He held it up again. 24A. His name was printed clearly. The flight attendant had to see it. But she didn't even look. Instead, she sighed loudly, as if he was the problem. "Sir, please," she said, her voice impatient. "Just take another seat." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Are you asking anyone else to move? Or just me?" The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. "Sir, I don't like your tone." Marcus wasn't surprised by that response. He had seen it before. It wasn't about tone. It wasn't about seating. It was about power. And she wanted him to give up. A voice from behind Marcus suddenly spoke. "He's right," a woman said. "If that's his seat, why should he have to move?" The flight attendant turned sharply. "Ma'am, please stay out of this." But now, more people were talking. "This isn't fair. He has his ticket. Just check it. Why does he have to move when she's in his seat?" The flight attendant looked flustered. She hadn't expected people to pay attention. Maybe she thought Marcus would just sit somewhere else and stay quiet. But he didn't. And neither did the passengers. The flight attendant huffed and pulled out her walkie-talkie. She pressed a button and spoke into it. "We have a situation in row 24, she said, keeping her voice low. "I need assistance." A few passengers gasped. "Assistance," one woman whispered. "For what?" "He's not doing anything wrong." Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was getting worse. He knew exactly what would happen next. He had seen videos of it before. People falsely accused, security called, and suddenly the person just trying to stand up for themselves was the one in trouble. His hands felt sweaty, but he kept his face calm. He wasn't afraid. He was prepared. Moments later, another flight attendant walked down the aisle. This one was older, with short gray hair and a serious expression. She looked more experienced, more professional. She stopped next to Marcus and folded her arms. "What's going on here?" Before Marcus could speak, the first flight attendant spoke up. "This passenger is refusing to take another seat," she said quickly. "He's holding up the boarding process." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. That wasn't true. The older flight attendant looked at Marcus. Her eyes were sharper, more focused. "Sir, can I see your ticket?" Finally, someone was willing to check. Marcus handed her the small piece of paper. She looked at it carefully. Then she turned to the woman sitting in his seat. "Ma'am, your ticket, please." The woman in Marcus's seat suddenly looked uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat but didn't pull out a ticket. I don't have it right now," she muttered. "I think I put it in my bag." The older flight attendant raised an eyebrow. "You don't have your ticket?" The woman forced a fake laugh. "Well, I must have thrown it away by accident." Now, the entire plane was watching. Marcus crossed his arms. He wasn't saying anything. He didn't have to. The woman in his seat didn't have a ticket for 24A. She had been caught. And now, she didn't know what to say. The older flight attendant looked at her and then back at Marcus. "Sir, you're right. This is your seat." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." But before he could sit down, the first flight attendant, the one who had tried to make him move, spoke again. "Well, he still needs to take another seat. We need to get moving." The passengers gasped. "What?" someone said. "That's ridiculous," another voice called out. The older flight attendant's face darkened. "No. That's not how this works," she said firmly. "He has a ticket. He gets to sit in his seat." Then, she turned to the younger flight attendant. "I need to see you in the back," she said in a low, serious voice. The younger flight attendant froze. "But..." The younger woman swallowed hard. She turned and quickly walked toward the back of the plane. Marcus could feel the tension in the air. The plane was silent for a moment. Then, the older flight attendant looked at the woman still sitting in his seat. "Ma'am, you need to move." The woman's face turned red. She mumbled something under her breath but finally stood up. She grabbed her bag and stomped down the aisle without looking back. As she walked away, someone clapped. Then another person. And then the entire section started clapping. Marcus sat down in his seat. And for the first time in the last 20 minutes, he let out a deep breath. The older flight attendant gave Marcus a small nod. "I'm very sorry about that, sir," she said. "Enjoy your flight." Marcus smiled. "Thank you." As she walked away, passengers kept talking. That was crazy. She tried to steal his seat and then lied about it. The first flight attendant was so wrong for that. Marcus didn't say anything else. He just looked out the window, watching the airport workers move bags below. He had stood up for himself. He had stayed calm. And in the end, the truth had won. Final thoughts? Sometimes, people think they can take what isn't theirs. They believe they can get away with it because no one will stand up to them. But Marcus didn't let it happen. And because he stood his ground, justice was served. Because the truth always wins. Marcus walked down the narrow aisle, pulling his small suitcase behind him. His backpack rested on one shoulder, and he gripped his ticket in his hand. 24A. A window seat. He had booked it weeks ago because he liked looking out at the sky while flying. Watching the clouds and the tiny buildings below always made him feel calm. It was one of the few things he enjoyed about flying. But when he reached row 24, he stopped. Something was wrong. A woman was already sitting in his seat. She wore a fancy red sweater and gold bracelets that jingled when she moved her hand. Her long nails tapped against her phone screen as she scrolled through something, completely ignoring the world around her. Marcus blinked, thinking maybe he had made a mistake. He glanced down at his ticket. 24A. No doubt about it. He looked at the row number again. 24. This was definitely his seat. A simple request. Marcus took a deep breath and spoke in a calm, polite voice. "Excuse me," he said, smiling slightly. "I think you're in my seat." The woman barely looked up. She glanced at him, then back at her phone. "I don't think so," she said with a small scoff. Marcus felt a twinge of confusion. Maybe she misunderstood. He held up his ticket. "See? 24A. I booked the window seat." The woman sighed loudly, as if this conversation was annoying her. "Well, I'm already sitting here," she said flatly. Marcus frowned. This wasn't how things worked. If someone was in the wrong seat, they moved. That was the rule. That was fair. He tried again. "I understand, but this is the seat I was assigned. Could you check your ticket?" The woman rolled her eyes. "I don't have it with me," she said, waving a hand. "It's probably in my bag." Marcus paused. Something about her tone felt off. She wasn't checking her ticket. She wasn't worried about being in the wrong seat. It was like she had already decided she wasn't going to move. His stomach tightened. The flight attendant arrives. Before Marcus could say anything else, a flight attendant appeared. She was young, with blonde hair tied in a neat bun. Her uniform was crisp, and she had a bright but forced smile. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, looking between Marcus and the woman. Marcus felt relieved. Finally, someone who could fix the problem. "Hi," he said, turning to the flight attendant. "I have a ticket for 24A, but this passenger is sitting in my seat." He showed his ticket again. The flight attendant barely glanced at it. Instead, she turned to the woman in the red sweater. "Ma'am, are you comfortable there?" Marcus froze. That was not the question he expected. The woman gave a sweet smile and nodded. "Oh yes, I'm fine here. Thank you." The flight attendant turned back to Marcus, her smile tightening. "Sir, I need you to take another seat," she said in a sharp tone. "We're trying to get everyone settled." Marcus blinked. "What?" he said, confused. The flight attendant sighed, as if he was the problem. "Just find another seat, sir," she said, her voice firm. "We're already behind schedule." Marcus could feel his pulse in his ears. "But this is my assigned seat," he said again, slower this time. The flight attendant's smile disappeared. "Sir, I'm asking you to move." Her voice was harder now. Less friendly. People start watching. The passengers around them started paying attention. Some whispered. Some peeked over their seats. Others just stared. A woman across the aisle frowned. A man in the row behind Marcus pulled out his phone. Marcus could feel the weight of all those eyes on him. But he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was standing in front of his assigned seat. He had his ticket. So why was the flight attendant acting like he was the problem? Marcus took a deep breath. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to be difficult," he said, keeping his voice calm. "But I paid for this seat. I booked it weeks ago." The flight attendant folded her arms. "There are other empty seats," she said coolly. Marcus glanced around. Middle seats. A few spots way in the back. But that wasn't the point. Why should he have to move? Why was she taking the other passenger's side without even checking? He swallowed the frustration building in his chest. "Can you at least check her ticket?" he asked, motioning to the woman in his seat. The flight attendant's expression changed. For the first time, she looked annoyed. "That won't be necessary," she snapped. Marcus's stomach tightened. The unspoken message. He had seen this before. It was in the way she looked at him. The way she didn't listen. She had made up her mind the second she walked over. She wasn't going to help him. And now, Marcus had a choice. He could sit somewhere else and let this happen. Or he could stand his ground. He tightened his grip on his bag. He wasn't moving. Passengers start speaking up. A voice broke the silence. "This isn't right," a woman behind Marcus said. The flight attendant turned. "Excuse me." The woman, a middle-aged lady with curly hair, crossed her arms. "I saw what happened. He's not in the wrong." Another passenger, a man with glasses, nodded. "Yeah, check the woman's ticket. If she has 24A, then fine. But if not, why should he move?" The flight attendant's face turned red. She wasn't expecting people to speak up. She looked around, realizing everyone was watching now. More whispers. More phones recording. The flight attendant's jaw tightened. Marcus saw something flicker across her face: hesitation. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize she had made a mistake. But instead of fixing it, she pulled out her walkie-talkie. She pressed a button and spoke in a low voice. "I need assistance in row 24, she muttered. Marcus's stomach dropped. She was calling for backup. Marcus stays calm. He forced himself to breathe. He had seen too many situations like this before. A person stands up for themselves. Someone in power doesn't like it. And suddenly, security is called. He could feel the tension. The weight of every whisper. Every stare. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He had paid for this seat. And he wasn't moving. The air inside the plane felt heavy. Marcus could hear the beep of the flight attendant's walkie-talkie. She had just called for assistance. People nearby shifted in their seats. Some leaned closer to hear what was happening. Others pulled out their phones, holding them at chest level, pretending not to record, but Marcus knew they were. His heart pounded. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't been rude. All he had done was ask for his seat, the one he paid for. So why was he being treated like a problem? A small act of courage. Marcus glanced at the woman still sitting in his seat. She was calm. Almost smug. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't worried about being asked to move. Because she knew. She knew the flight attendant was on her side. Marcus clenched his jaw. He felt something deep in his chest, something he had felt before in situations just like this. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. Tired of always being the one expected to step back. Tired of being treated as if he didn't belong. But today, he wasn't stepping back. The backup arrives. 2 more flight attendants appeared at the front of the plane. A tall man with dark hair and a woman with a short blonde ponytail. The first flight attendant, let's call her Sarah, motioned them over. The male flight attendant, Mark, spoke first. "What's the problem?" Sarah sighed dramatically and pointed at Marcus. "This passenger is refusing to take another seat." Marcus inhaled slowly. That word. Refusing. As if he was doing something wrong. Mark turned to Marcus. "Sir, I'm sure we can find you a different seat." "No," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. "I don't want a different seat. I want my seat." Mark blinked, surprised by the steady way Marcus spoke. The blonde flight attendant, Kelly, tilted her head. "Sir, maybe it's best if you just move so we can avoid a situation." Marcus let out a dry laugh. Avoid a situation? Wasn't that exactly what he was trying to do by following the rules? Before he could respond, the woman in his seat suddenly spoke. "Oh my goodness," she sighed, shaking her head. "Why is this such a big deal? He can just sit somewhere else." Marcus turned his head slowly to look at her. "Why is this such a big deal?" She said it so casually, like she didn't understand why he wouldn't just accept it and move on. Like his fair treatment didn't matter. Marcus had enough. The turning point. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With one quick movement, he opened the airline's booking app and pulled up his ticket. Holding it up, he showed it to everyone. "Here is my seat," he said, clearly. 24A. Window seat. That's what I booked. That's what I paid for. Silence. Sarah, the first flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't expected Marcus to prove himself so easily. Passengers murmured. A man a few rows back spoke up. "Yeah, looks like he's right. So why is he the one being told to move?" A woman across the aisle nodded. "Seriously, this is ridiculous. Just check her ticket." Marcus turned back to Sarah, Mark, and Kelly. "If she also has a ticket for 24A, I'll move. But if she doesn't, she needs to give me my seat." The woman in his seat tensed. Sarah hesitated. For the first time, she looked nervous. She had been so confident that Marcus would just move. That he wouldn't push back. But now, everyone was watching. Now, the pressure was on her. The flight attendant's choice. Sarah cleared her throat. "Ma'am, can you show me your ticket?" The woman in Marcus's seat suddenly looked uncomfortable. Her confidence cracked. She gave a fake laugh. "Oh, I don't have it with me. It's in my bag somewhere." Kelly frowned. "Well, let's check your email confirmation." The woman sighed dramatically, acting offended. "Seriously? You're going to waste time checking that?" Sarah glanced around and saw dozens of eyes on her. People were waiting. Waiting to see if she would follow the rules, or if she would keep trying to push Marcus aside. Finally, Sarah exhaled sharply. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tight, "if you don't have proof of your ticket for 24A, I'm going to have to ask you to move." Marcus stayed silent. The woman's face flushed red. She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but she knew she couldn't. She grabbed her bag, stood up, and stormed into the aisle. She didn't even look at Marcus as she shoved past him and plopped into an empty seat near the middle of the plane. Sarah avoided eye contact with Marcus. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge that she had been wrong. Instead, she gave a fake smile and said, "Enjoy your flight." Marcus didn't respond. He just shook his head and sat down. Finally, in his seat. Passengers speak up. As soon as Marcus settled into his seat, a voice spoke from behind him. "That was insane," a woman muttered. A man across the aisle leaned in. "That was so wrong, man. They tried to push you around for no reason." Another passenger, an older gentleman, sighed. "I've seen it happen before. People like her always expect to get their way." Marcus just nodded. He knew what they meant. He had lived it too many times before. But today? He had stood his ground. And even though it shouldn't have been this hard, it felt like a victory. The aftermath. 20 minutes later, the plane took off. The sky outside was bright blue, the clouds soft like cotton. Marcus leaned his head back, finally able to breathe. A flight attendant, not Sarah, walked past and slipped him a small card. He looked down. It was a voucher for a free meal and drink. A small act of kindness. A quiet way of saying, "We saw what happened. And it wasn't right." Marcus smiled. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something is enough. This story wasn't just about a seat. It was about fairness. About not letting people push you aside. About standing firm when you know you're right even when it's uncomfortable. And most of all, it was about not staying silent. Because when one person speaks up, others find the courage to do the same. And that's how things change. Marcus kept his voice steady. He had learned long ago that people expected him to get angry, to raise his voice, to make a scene, but he wasn't going to give them that. Instead, he took a deep breath, looked the flight attendant in the eye, and repeated, "I'd like to speak to a supervisor." For a second, nobody moved. The woman still sat in his seat, arms crossed, looking as if she had won. The flight attendant's jaw tightened. She didn't like that. She had expected him to just give up and move. Passengers whispered. More phones were out now, cameras quietly recording. And that's when things started to change. A few rows behind Marcus, a man with glasses cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been watching this whole thing, and the man's right. He paid for that seat. Why is he being told to move?" The flight attendant's eyes snapped toward the man. She looked annoyed, but she forced a tight smile. "Sir, we're just trying to resolve the situation quickly," she said. The man raised an eyebrow. "Then why not ask her to move?" He pointed to the woman sitting in Marcus's seat. "Why does he have to be the one to give up his spot?" A woman across the aisle nodded. "Yeah, this doesn't seem fair." The murmurs grew louder. More passengers were paying attention now. Marcus could feel the shift. The power was changing. The flight attendant, clearly flustered, grabbed her walkie-talkie. "I'll call the supervisor," she muttered. Marcus stayed quiet. He folded his arms and waited. The woman in his seat? She wasn't smiling anymore. Minutes later, a tall man in a navy blue uniform stepped onto the plane. His name tag read David, flight supervisor. He looked calm but serious. He could already sense that something was off. The flight attendant, still trying to control the situation, quickly turned to him. "Sir, we have a passenger here who's refusing to move seats. We just need him to cooperate so we can take off." David's brows furrowed. "Who booked the seat?" Marcus immediately held up his phone. "Me. I paid for 24A. Here's my ticket." David took one glance at the screen and then turned to the woman in Marcus's seat. "Ma'am, may I see your ticket, please?" She froze. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, she let out an awkward laugh and started fumbling with her purse. "Oh, I must have deleted my email. But I'm sure I was given this seat." David's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, if you can't show proof that 24A is yours, I'll have to ask you to move." The woman's face turned red. "The passengers watching?" They nodded in agreement. Some even whispered, "Finally." For a second, it looked like the woman was going to argue. Her hands clenched into fists. Her eyes flickered toward the flight attendant, almost as if she was waiting for backup. But Sarah, the flight attendant, said nothing. She knew that arguing now would only make things worse. Finally, with a loud huff, the woman grabbed her purse, stood up, and stomped into the aisle. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't apologize. She just moved. And as she did, a few passengers clapped quietly. Marcus exhaled. He had won. David, the supervisor, turned back to Marcus. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, sir. Please take your seat." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." But as he sat down, he noticed something. Sarah, the flight attendant, didn't apologize. Not even once. She just pressed her lips together, turned around, and walked away. Marcus wasn't surprised. As Marcus got comfortable in his rightful seat, the man with glasses leaned over and said, "I'm glad you stood your ground." A woman across the aisle shook her head. "They really thought you'd just move. Like your ticket didn't matter." An older woman a few rows up smiled kindly. "You handled that with grace, young man. Some people would have gotten angry, but you kept your cool." Marcus nodded, taking it all in. Because today, he hadn't just stood up for himself. He had shown everyone on that plane that fairness mattered. And the best part? People saw it. They recognized it. And they spoke up, too. About 30 minutes later, the plane took off. Marcus looked out the window, the clouds rolling by like soft pillows. And then, something unexpected happened. A different flight attendant, not Sarah, walked up and quietly handed Marcus a small envelope. He looked up, confused. "It's from the airline," she whispered. "We just wanted to say sorry for what happened." Marcus opened it and found a voucher for a free meal and drink. It was a small gesture. But it meant something. A quiet way of saying, "We saw what happened. And it wasn't right." Marcus gave a small smile. It wasn't much. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about fairness. About not letting people push you aside. About standing your ground even when it's uncomfortable. And most of all, it was about speaking up. Because when one person speaks up, others find the courage to do the same. And that's how things change. Marcus leaned back in his seat, but his mind was still buzzing. He had won, sure, but something felt off. The way the flight attendant, Sarah, had treated him. The way she had ignored the truth until she had no choice but to listen. And the woman? She had never admitted she was wrong. Marcus sighed. He wasn't expecting a full apology, but at least some basic respect would have been nice. As the plane settled at cruising altitude, he closed his eyes and tried to relax. About 20 minutes later, the man with glasses who had stood up for Marcus earlier leaned over again. "I just wanted to say," he said in a low voice, "I don't think this was a mistake." Marcus opened his eyes. "What do you mean?" The man pushed up his glasses. "That flight attendant?" She wasn't confused about whose seat it was. She knew. Marcus frowned. "Then why?" "Because," the man whispered, "some people think they can get away with things if they pressure the right person." Marcus stared at him, his stomach turning. The man was right. Sarah had never asked the woman to show her ticket. She had only told Marcus to move. This wasn't about a mistake. This was about who they thought would give up first. Another woman, sitting across the aisle, spoke up. "I saw it too. They tried to make you move because they thought you wouldn't fight back." An older woman nodded. "I've seen this kind of thing before. People test their power, see how much they can push someone." Marcus sighed. He had felt it in his gut from the beginning. He wasn't crazy. This had been intentional. A little while later, Sarah walked down the aisle. She wasn't looking at Marcus. She wasn't making eye contact with anyone who had spoken up. But the air felt different now. More people were watching her. She knew that they knew. And that was powerful. Marcus didn't need her apology anymore. She had already lost. Just as Marcus was about to put on his headphones, the other flight attendant, the one who had given him the voucher, stopped by his seat. She hesitated. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "I saw everything. I want you to know, not all of us are like that." Marcus looked up at her. She looked genuinely sorry. "I believe you," he said simply. She nodded, her face relieved. Then, she added, "People are talking. The airline is going to hear about this." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Are they?" She smiled a little. Passengers are already emailing customer service. The videos. Some of them are being posted right now. Marcus's heart jumped. So people hadn't just watched. They were doing something about it. By the time the plane landed, Marcus could feel the shift. Sarah looked nervous as she stood near the exit, avoiding eye contact. The woman who had stolen his seat? She rushed off the plane quickly, head down, not saying a word. But the passengers? They were talking. People whispered as they grabbed their bags. Phones were buzzing. Someone showed Marcus a Twitter post, a video of the whole situation, with the caption, "This man was forced to fight for his own seat. Why? Watch and decide for yourself." And below it? Thousands of comments. As Marcus stepped into the airport, he wasn't alone. The man with glasses walked beside him. The older woman who had supported him earlier smiled at him as she passed. And then a security officer approached. Marcus tensed, but the officer gave him a polite nod. "Sir," he said, "the airline has been notified about what happened. A manager would like to speak with you." Marcus blinked. "Now?" The officer nodded. "Yes. And I believe there's something you'll want to see." Marcus followed the officer to a quiet office near the terminal. Inside, a woman in a business suit stood waiting. "Mr. Johnson," she said, offering her hand. "My name is Rebecca Carter. I'm the regional manager for the airline." Marcus shook her hand. "Nice to meet you." Rebecca's face was serious. "First of all, I want to personally apologize for what happened on your flight today. We have reviewed passenger reports, video evidence, and statements from our crew." She paused. Then, she said the words Marcus hadn't expected to hear. "The flight attendant, Sarah, has been removed from duty. Effective immediately." Marcus's breath caught. "Wait," he said slowly. "You mean, she's fired?" Rebecca gave a firm nod. "Yes." She gestured to a laptop on the desk. "There were too many witnesses. Too much proof. Our airline does not tolerate discrimination of any kind." Marcus was speechless. Rebecca continued, "I also want you to know we'll be reaching out to all passengers on that flight to ensure they understand what happened and what actions we are taking. We take this very seriously." Marcus nodded. "That's good to hear." Rebecca smiled slightly. "One more thing." She reached into a folder and pulled out a voucher. "This is a full refund for your flight," she said, handing it to him. "And a free first-class ticket anywhere we fly, no expiration." Marcus stared at the ticket. He hadn't expected this. At first, he thought about turning it down. But then, he thought about why this was happening. He had spoken up. Passengers had stood with him. And now, change had happened. So, he took the ticket. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told to move, to be quiet, to just accept things as they were. No more. As Marcus walked out of the airport, he wasn't just another passenger anymore. He was someone who had stood his ground. And in the end, that made all the difference. The air inside the cabin felt heavy. People had stopped talking. The whispers had died down. Every eye was locked on one moment, one person, the younger flight attendant. She stood there, arms crossed, face tense, but she wasn't speaking anymore. The older flight attendant, clearly a supervisor, stood firm. Her voice had been calm but powerful. "This man," she repeated, nodding at Marcus, "has his ticket. This is his seat." The younger flight attendant's jaw clenched. The woman sitting in Marcus's seat shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since this all began, it seemed neither of them knew what to say. The silence didn't last long. "That's right," a voice called from the back. Everyone turned. It was the man with glasses, the one who had spoken up before. "I saw the whole thing," he said loudly. "This man didn't do anything wrong. He was being forced to move for no reason." Other passengers nodded. Another woman, further down the aisle, added, "She never even checked the woman's ticket. She just told him to move." The older flight attendant's expression darkened. She turned back to the younger one. "Is this true?" The younger flight attendant hesitated. Her face turned red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The woman in Marcus's seat suddenly stood up. She grabbed her purse and muttered, "This is ridiculous." She pushed past the aisle without looking at Marcus. Without looking at anyone. Passengers moved out of her way. No one said anything. But their eyes followed her as she walked toward the front of the plane, her face burning with embarrassment. She was caught. And now, she was running from it. Marcus exhaled slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just took his seat. His rightful seat. The older flight attendant turned to the younger one. "Meet me in the galley," she said, voice sharp. "Now." The younger flight attendant's eyes widened. But I was just trying to." "Now." The flight attendant swallowed. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the back of the plane. Passengers watched her go, some shaking their heads, some whispering to each other. Justice was happening. And everyone could feel it. As Marcus settled in his seat, the man with glasses leaned over again. "You okay?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah. Thanks for speaking up." The man smiled. "You didn't deserve that. None of us would." Another woman across the aisle spoke. "You handled that with so much patience. I don't know if I could have stayed that calm." A few others nodded in agreement. Then someone did something unexpected. A woman in the row behind Marcus reached out and patted his shoulder. "We were all with you," she said kindly. Marcus felt a warmth in his chest. This was more than just getting his seat back. This was about people standing up together. About 30 minutes later, after the plane had reached cruising altitude, Marcus noticed something. The younger flight attendant, the one who had given him so much trouble, was gone. She had vanished. A different flight attendant was now serving drinks in her place. Marcus exchanged a glance with the man with glasses. "Where'd she go?" Marcus asked. The man chuckled softly. "I think we both know the answer to that." Marcus's stomach flipped. Had she been removed from duty? Had the older flight attendant fired her on the spot? Whatever happened, one thing was clear. She had learned a lesson today. And the whole plane had seen it. An hour into the flight, Marcus was still processing everything when the older flight attendant returned. She stopped beside his seat. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice softer now. Marcus looked up. "I want to personally apologize," she continued. "What happened today should never have happened. It was unacceptable." Marcus studied her face. "She meant it?" "I appreciate that," he said. She nodded, and then, to his surprise, she handed him something. "A voucher. For the trouble you experienced today, the airline is offering you a full refund," she explained. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A refund?" She smiled slightly. "And a free upgrade for your next flight. First class." Marcus blinked. He hadn't expected this. He took the voucher, turning it over in his hands. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said. "No," the flight attendant replied, "thank you for staying calm, for handling this the way you did. And for reminding everyone on this flight what's right." She turned to leave but then paused. "The other flight attendant," she added. "She won't be working for this airline anymore." Marcus sat back. It was done. As the plane flew through the clouds, Marcus stared out the window. He thought about everything that had happened. About how one moment of injustice could turn into something much bigger. About how strangers had stood up for him. And about how, sometimes, doing the right thing came at a cost. But in the end, it was always worth it. Marcus took a deep breath, letting everything sink in. He had stood his ground. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene, but he also hadn't let someone push him around. The flight continued smoothly. The tension that had once filled the cabin slowly faded away. People went back to their books, their conversations, their in-flight movies. But something had changed. People looked at Marcus differently now. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect. The flight attendant who had treated him unfairly was gone. Justice had been served. And the airline had taken responsibility. An hour before landing, the older flight attendant, the supervisor, returned to Marcus's row. She carried a small tray with a cup of warm tea and a neatly wrapped cookie. "I know it's not much," she said with a small smile, "but I wanted to bring you this. Just a small thank you for being so patient today." Marcus was surprised. He had already received an apology, a refund, and a first-class upgrade for his next flight. But this was something different. This was human. A small act of kindness, one person to another. Marcus smiled as he accepted the tray. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The supervisor nodded, then lowered her voice. "You know," she said, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening, "this isn't the first time we've had a complaint about her." Marcus raised an eyebrow. The flight attendant sighed. She had been warned before. Several times. Today was the last straw. Marcus thought about that. About how some people never change until they have to. "I hope she learns from it," he said finally. The supervisor nodded. "Me too." And with that, she walked away, leaving Marcus with his thoughts. Landing and the final goodbye. As the plane began its descent, Marcus felt lighter. The stress from earlier? Gone. He glanced out the window, watching as the city lights below grew closer and brighter. When the plane landed, people stood up, stretching, reaching for their bags. Marcus took his time. As he stood, gathering his things, a few passengers paused to speak to him. A woman in a blue sweater gave him a quick nod. "Glad you got your seat back," she said. Another man, an older gentleman, patted Marcus's shoulder as he passed by. "Good for you," he said simply. Marcus smiled. He hadn't expected any of this. But he had learned something important. Sometimes, standing up for yourself doesn't just help you, it shows others that they can stand up too. The last unexpected surprise. As Marcus walked up the jet bridge, pulling his carry-on behind him, he heard someone call his name. "Mr. Johnson." He turned. A woman in a dark blue suit stood near the terminal gate. She had an official airline badge clipped to her jacket. "Yes," Marcus said, stopping. She stepped forward with a warm but serious expression. "My name is Rachel," she said. "I'm a customer relations manager for the airline." Marcus nodded slowly. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened today," she continued. "That kind of treatment does not reflect our company's values. We've already taken action to make sure it never happens again." Marcus listened carefully. Rachel took a deep breath. "We'd like to offer you another free flight. Anywhere you want to go. Anytime." Marcus blinked. "Wait, another free flight?" She smiled. "Yes. You've already been refunded for this one, but we want to do more. We want to show you that we truly value you as a customer." Marcus looked down at the voucher she handed him. "Any destination. Anytime. First class." He let out a low whistle. "That's very generous," he said. Rachel nodded. We want to do the right thing. Marcus studied her face. She meant it. And for the first time since the flight began, Marcus felt like he truly mattered. As he walked through the airport, past the busy travelers and bright signs, Marcus thought about what had just happened. He thought about the woman who took his seat. He thought about the flight attendant who tried to push him around. And he thought about everyone who had stood up for him. One person's bad actions had been seen by many. But so had the good ones. Marcus had simply wanted his rightful seat. But in the process, he had witnessed something bigger. When people speak up, when people stand together, change happens. And today, it did. Respect should never be a choice. It should not depend on who you are, what you look like, or where you come from. Respect is something everyone deserves. Marcus didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't want extra favors. He only wanted what was already his rightful seat. And when someone tried to take it from him, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't fight back with anger. He stood his ground. He spoke up. And in the end, justice was served. Because sometimes, the truth is the loudest voice in the room. It's easy to think, it's not worth it. Maybe I should just let it go. But what happens when everyone stays silent? What happens when no one speaks up? The unfair people keep winning. The bad behavior continues. And the next person, the next Marcus, goes through the same thing. That's why standing up matters. Even when it's hard. Even when you feel alone. Because doing the right thing doesn't just help you, it helps others, too. Think about everyone on that plane. At first, most people stayed quiet. They didn't want to get involved. They looked away. One person pulled out their phone. Another whispered, "That's not right." More and more people started paying attention. And by the end of the flight, Marcus got his rightful seat. The unfair flight attendant faced consequences. The airline took action to make things right. And every single person on that plane left with a lesson they would never forget. One person standing up can inspire others to do the same. One voice can create a ripple that leads to real change. Imagine if Marcus had just walked away. Imagine if he had let them take his seat without saying a word. The rude flight attendant would have kept treating people unfairly. The woman who took his seat would have never learned a lesson. The airline would have never known there was a problem. But Marcus didn't stay silent. And because of that, the right people listened. Change happened. And next time, maybe someone else will find the courage to stand up, too. Marcus wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. But he knew his worth. And that made all the difference. So ask yourself. Have you ever been in a situation where someone treated you unfairly? Did you speak up? Or did you stay silent? If you could go back, what would you do differently? Because the truth is, we all have a moment like this in life. A moment where we have to decide. Do I let it go? Or do I stand up for myself? The next time that moment comes, remember Marcus. Remember that your voice matters. And never be afraid to take your rightful seat. Respect should never be something people pick and choose to give. It should not depend on what you look like. It should not depend on where you come from. It should not depend on how much money you have. Respect is for everyone. But sometimes, the world does not work that way. Sometimes, people look down on others. They think they can push people aside just because they feel more important. That is what happened to Marcus. And for a moment, it seemed like no one cared. But then, everything changed. Because Marcus did not back down. He stood his ground, not with anger, not with yelling, but with calm and steady confidence. And in the end, justice was served. Because sometimes, the only thing louder than words, is the truth. It would have been easy for Marcus to stay silent. He could have thought, it's just a seat. Maybe I should just move. He could have thought, it's not worth the trouble. He could have given up his rightful place just to avoid the fight. And maybe, just maybe, no one would have noticed. No one would have recorded the moment. No one would have cared. The flight attendant would have kept her job. The woman in his seat would have kept pretending she was right. And Marcus? He would have sat somewhere else, feeling angry, but powerless. But Marcus did not stay silent. He knew one simple truth. Right is right. Wrong is wrong. And standing up for yourself is always worth it. And when he asked for a supervisor, everything turned around. In the beginning, no one wanted to get involved. Passengers looked away. Some whispered quietly. Others simply hoped the problem would go away. But then, one person started recording the moment. Then another person spoke up. Soon, people were watching, listening, paying attention. And suddenly, the unfair flight attendant was not in control anymore. The power had shifted. And Marcus? He got his rightful seat. Because of one voice. Because of one moment of courage. One person can change everything. Let's imagine something different. Let's imagine that Marcus had let them push him aside. He would have sat somewhere else, feeling small and disrespected. The flight attendant would have kept treating others unfairly, thinking she could get away with it. The woman in his seat would have never faced the truth, believing she was more important than others. The airline would have never learned about the problem. And worst of all, every person on that plane would have watched injustice happen, and done nothing. And next time, maybe they would stay silent again. And again. And again. But that's not what happened. Because Marcus did not walk away. He stood up. And now, things will never be the same. Marcus's story is about so much more than just a seat on a plane. It is about fairness. Respect. Knowing your worth. It is about choosing to speak up when something is wrong, even when it is difficult. Because if no one stands up, nothing will ever change. If people just let things happen, the world stays the same. But when someone dares to stand their ground, that is when change begins. That is when fairness wins. Others start to follow. Think about the people on that plane. At first, they were silent. But by the end, they were watching. They were recording. They were paying attention. Some of them may have never spoken up before in their lives. But now, they know what it looks like to stand for what is right. And maybe, just maybe, next time, they will be the ones to speak up. Because courage is contagious. One brave act can inspire 1,000 more. So what about you? Have you ever been in a situation where someone treated you unfairly? Did you speak up? Or did you stay silent? Think about it. Because one day, you will face a moment like Marcus did. A moment where you have to decide. Do I let it go? Or do I stand up for myself? The next time that moment comes, remember Marcus. Remember that your voice matters. And never be afraid to take your rightful seat.